All right, Jeff, it looks like I was able to share my screen, but I want to confirm that it's working correctly.
Yep, it looks like you are sharing the screen. Looks great.
Okay, great. Thank you for your help.
Okay, then I believe we're ready. Is that correct?
We're all set in terms of screen sharing and have the presentation loaded, so.
Great.
I think so.
So we're on item 7, education funding study. We'll let Tiffany Stanley introduce this.
Yes, thank you. So Tiffany Stanley, Chief of Staff at the Utah State Board of Education. So I am looking forward to the researchers presenting their findings and implications of this final phase of the funding study that we commissioned back in 2019. And given I think we're about an hour behind, let's just get to it. I'll turn it over to Wested to get us started. I think Jason or Alex will kick us off.
Great. Thanks so much, Tiffany, and thank you, Chair Huntsman, Vice Chair Cummins, and the rest of the Utah State Board for the opportunity to present to you today. We're coming today with a Phase 2 project update, and our agenda for the day, next slide, Alex, is going to look at a couple of things. So we'll do a brief overview of the Phase 2 of the study. So just a reminder to the members of the board and the public what Phase 2 of this study is comprised of as compared to Phase 1. We are going to share some of the activities of the funding work group. Alex and Justin will provide an update on where the Phase 2 analysis is. And then we'll close with some questions and answers and a little bit of a look ahead to December and January to close out the study itself. Go ahead, next slide, Alex. One more, please. Thanks. So just a reminder to the Board of Education and to the public around the set of phases and activities that we had for this project. Phase 1, which we presented to the board last year, included looking at, for example, core components of the minimum school program, beginning to do some work around the role and balance of state and local contribution. Go ahead, next slide, Alex. But also looking at some of our initial equity analyses that used Utah's own specific data to look at issues of horizontal, vertical equity, as well as fiscal neutrality. We also included in that Phase 1 report elements of methods or analyses of methods of counting students, but also year-round schooling review that were included in the now published Phase 1 report. And this was, as we've described, go to the next slide, Alex, really about using the Phase 1 report as a foundation, the kind of current understanding of Utah's school funding system in relationship to its priorities, in relationship to its to other mechanisms of raising funds at the local level, to really dive deeper through Phase 2, looking at these three concepts in particular around analyzing equalization, and in particular, some of the ways in which localities raise funds for school districts relative to the state's effort as well, and using a strong statistical model, which we'll talk a bit about today, which we refer to as a cost function analysis that allows us to look at the relationship between spending and outcomes for students while holding constant other variables, introducing other variables to understand the influence of cost on the outcome of students from a correlational standpoint. And finally, this notion of successful schools, which asks the question of how well systems that we see, schools in particular, in the context of school districts, or how well they are spending resources relative to the outcomes we were seeing in the model. Go to the next slide, Alex. So I think a good reminder here of just the way that we've designed the study itself. Everything that I just reviewed in terms of Phase 1 and Phase 2 are kind of represented here graphically. Go to the next slide, Alex. And so this first component really looks at appropriation, kind of identifying core components. Next slide. Looking at distribution and sources. So as I had mentioned before, the cost function analysis builds on the initial equity analyses that we had started in Phase 1, and that the sources, looking at the role and balance of state and local funds, defining the local share from Phase 1, was further built on in regards to looking and investigating equalization policies in phase 2, which Justin will talk a bit about today. I'll go to the next slide, Alex. And finally, looking at the successful schools. So this is that investigation of the effectiveness or the how well, and in particular, taking a deeper dive with school level administrators, school level staff, as well as the context of the school district to understand things like how district investments are being used, program implementation, non-monetary resources, and program monitoring for both charter and non-charter schools. Go to the next slide, Alex. So putting all these pieces together, this just gives you a visual representation of, again, those kind of core components in phase 1 and what we were building towards in terms of phase 2. So those core components of the cost function, equalization, and successful schools that are building towards a series of policy recommendations for the state of Utah following this review of the state's school funding system. So go ahead to the next slide, Alex. And this in particular, we think is important in the context of our conversation today, is just really a note about the term equity. So in our context, as researchers that investigate school financing, obviously, equity can mean a lot of different things to different people. So we thought it was important just to ground our conversation today with the board and the public about the context of how we refer to equity and how we think about it from the research perspective relative to this issue. And that one, all children have kind of reasonably equal educational opportunities, and that those educational opportunities do not depend on a place of residence or an economic situation. And that in fact, those circumstances lead us to understand that resources are necessary in an equitable approach to basically allow students to reach that standard of equal educational opportunities. So I'll close my segment there and I'll turn it over to Tiffany, and she can talk a little bit about the funding work group and kind of activities up to this point. Tiffany?
Thanks, Jason, for that context and introduction. So we're kind of backloading the good stuff with the findings and the potential implications coming right up. But before we got into that, I think as the researchers review the findings and you begin to think about those implications, it's helpful to keep in mind what Utah's funding system is intended to accomplish. In other words, the principles that guide the way the system is designed. I think thinking about these things really informs any conversations of the findings becoming actionable in our context. So these principles are contained in statute, and I'll review that language and give you some examples in a moment. But first, wanted to provide the definitions. So first is the principle of differentiation to account for student needs. And this is essentially the concept that students with different levels of needs should receive different levels of resources to ensure equal educational opportunities. Next is the principle of equalized capacity for equalized effort. And this is essentially the concept that a taxpayer's given level of tax effort should generate the same revenue regardless of the taxable assessed value and number of students in the school district for which the tax is levied. So third is the concept of local participation and control. And this is essentially, in this context, the concept that a school district should have the independent authority to levy taxes, keep the revenue generated in the school district, and determine how to spend revenue. So going to the next slide, to make this more concrete, this is the actual language of the statute with the crosswalk to some of the programs that are currently in place to address each principle that'll pop up as we go through. So first is this language in blue, which is at the tail end of this statement. So it recognizes the minimum school program recognizes that all children of the state are entitled to reasonably equal educational opportunities. And then this phrase, regardless of their place of residence in the state and of the economic situation of their respective school districts or other agencies. So this relates to that second principle I described of equalized capacity for equalized effort. And there you see a couple of examples of programs intended to address this principle, like NESS and the voted and board local levy guarantee programs. So next, I'll breeze past that minimum basic rate. That's not directly related to the principles per se. The language down below in green. So this relates to the third principle I described. So this chapter also recognizes that each locality should be empowered to provide educational facilities and opportunities beyond the minimum program, and accordingly provide a method whereby that latitude of action is permitted and encouraged. So that's that concept of local participation and control. And a few examples of programs intended to address it include really the local property taxes that school districts are authorized to levy, including the board and the capital. So then jumping back up to the language in orange. So it's this statement that all children of the state are entitled to reasonably equal educational opportunities. This is a broad concept, but one of the principles it relates to is the first principle I described, which is differentiating funding based on student need to ensure all students have an equal opportunity. So examples of programs that do this in our current system are like the special education add-on, which provides supplemental funding to account for students' differential needs, or the EARS program, or the Enhancement for At-Risk Students program. So jumping forward, in reviewing these principles, I think pretty quickly you begin to realize that there are some inherent tensions and trade-offs among them. For example, often state funds are used to account for differences in ability to generate revenue among school districts, or to provide differential funding based on student need, but using more state income tax can mean less local participation and control. So that's just one example, and really given those tensions and trade-offs, it leads to a conversation about balance, and how an ideal system would balance these principles, how our current system balances these principles. So about a month ago, we convened a group to dig into that question of how an ideal system would balance and how our current system compares to that. And the takeaway from that initial conversation with a group was that they felt the ideal system would prioritize differentiated funding based on student need to a greater extent than our current system does. But we will be continuing to gather input on this question. I think it really informs policy discussions surrounding the study. So we'll be continuing to kind of think through these tensions and potentially unpack them further with you as a board, perhaps in December when we continue the conversation. So with that framing and context, I'll turn it back to Wested to walk you through the high-level findings and potential implications of phase 2.
Thanks, Tiffany. So I'm going to pick it up from here, and we wanted to delve into the analysis methods, especially with respect to the cost function analysis, before talking about our findings and where some of our focus will be with respect to the recommendations from phase 2 and the study overall. And so I just want to note before I jump in that there are really 3 analyses in phase 2, and I'm going to talk about the cost function because it's the most complex, and we thought it might be helpful to unpack it a little bit. But the equalization analysis and the successful schools analysis are also really critical to phase 2. So I don't want to imply giving them short shrift by not talking about them here. But I think that if there are any questions about those analysis methods, we're happy to delve into that if it comes up. So the first thing we wanted to cover is just what common methods exist for answering the type of question that our cost function analysis is focused on. And there are really 4, and they're divided into 2 categories generally. And I won't delve into all 4 of them at this time in detail, but we did want to say that there's kind of an input-based approach which thinks about what resources should be a part of the profile of resources and funding provided to school districts and schools, and whether or not those are optimal. And then the other two kind of look more at the outputs of the system and whether those outputs reflect the expectations and principles of the system. And you'll notice here that the two output-based approaches are the two types of analyses that are in our phase 2 study. And so I think just that reflects our focus on an outputs-based approach to this type of analysis. So then digging a little bit more into the cost function, we wanted to talk about what we will be able to do and what you can expect from it and what it really won't be able to speak to. The research question here is it's a little bit technical in the way that it's worded, but it is essentially looking at this question of how does educational context influence the resource needs of a school to meet some common standard outcome that's consistent across the state system. And it is looking at this question both for the extent to which outcomes and spending are associated, and additional spending is predicted if outcomes are greater and all other things are equal. And also how do different pieces of context change resource needs. So what it will do is it will provide estimates to that effect, and looking at how cost factors such as students educated and the school setting, as the district setting, affect what the sort of estimated resource needs are. What it won't be able to do, and I think this is important to acknowledge up front, is it won't be able to explain why the estimates in the cost function are what they are in terms of what is done with the resources themselves. It's looking at total resources and looking at associations and a variety of different parts of the context, but more information is needed to know a little bit about what's going on in each individual school and district. And that's where the successful schools analysis comes in, is digging more into practices at the local level. It also isn't strong enough in terms of its rigor to have anything to say about whether a certain level of spending causes outcomes or a certain level of spending for a particular type of school or district would cause a set of outcomes. It is really an analysis to look at the associations that exist. But we just want to be clear, we're not able to get to that point where like an experimental design would be able to say, this is causing something to occur. In terms of the foundation of the analysis, we wanted to share this graphic to illustrate kind of at a basic level what it's doing. And really what I've kind of described in the prior slides, but essentially we're holding constant, we're saying if a school is the same in all of these different ways in terms of size, in terms of how the salaries are, the salary for a given teacher in their community, the level of needs among students, what level of schooling they serve. If all of those things are the same and the only thing that's different is their outcomes, or are their outcomes, what spending is predicted for the school with the lower outcomes versus the one with the higher. And so this is kind of a foundational piece of the analysis, and this is illustrating the findings that are related to outcomes and spending. But we also are using a similar approach to talk about the educational context, how, for example, if the only thing that differs is the level of student need and outcomes are held constant along with all of these other factors, how is spending different in the model and in sort of the historical data we're analyzing. So we wanted to give that overview of the foundation of it. Again, just because we feel like there's a lot to unpack with the cost function, and so we wanted to give at least a little bit more detail before we dive into the findings. The last thing to share is just that there are several types of data that we're including in the analysis. And this is an overview here. I think the most important thing to highlight is in terms of outcomes for students, we're interested in, and we've included in the model, growth with respect to test scores and graduation. And it's a school level analysis, so all of this is looking into these findings with respect to a school rather than looking at it at the district level. So I'm going to keep us going into the general findings, but if there are questions, we have a question and answer session, but I also don't want, it's a lot to go through, so I certainly, if anyone wants to jump in with a question, please do. So the general findings summary we're going to provide today is really providing a set of key findings organized within the general topics we plan to provide recommendations for. And we're going to talk a little bit about where those recommendations will be focused, but we're still finalizing the actual recommendations. So we'll share our findings and we'll share where we're focusing our attention with respect to the final recommendations. But before we dive in, I wanted to just share an overview of some the overarching conclusions that we're coming to with phase 2 and overall in the study. And the first, just to recap that in phase 2, we really zeroed in on the overall funding system with special consideration to this principle that Tiffany mentioned of ensuring reasonably equal educational opportunity with respect to local capacity to raise revenue and educational context. For example, things like student needs, the size of the district, et cetera. And what we're finding is that overall, the fundamentals of the education funding system in Utah are strong, that it creates a foundation for, well-designed to meet the principles that Tiffany went over. And that really our recommendations, when we do finalize them, they really will be identifying possible opportunities to improve within what we, again, have concluded to be a very strong foundation based on our analyses. And so in terms of those areas of focus, we're looking into funding generation or source of funding, funding distribution in a few areas, targeted funding. This is mostly with respect to categorical programs like those in the related to basic part of the minimum school program. And then effective practices, that will be mainly drawing on the successful schools analysis. What are really successful environments in the state doing with their dollars? How are they organizing their resource use? And today we're really going to dig into the first two, which is where the majority of the findings we're prepared to share and the focus of our recommendations are at this time. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Justin, who's going to talk about the funding generation part of this.
Great.
Can we pause just a second? Pardon me. We do have a board member with a hand up. I don't know if her question was specific to Alex's presentation. Board Member Earl.
Thank you. I guess I just back on a few of the slides. I had a couple of questions. Do I wait till the end or is now appropriate time? Because I thought he was asking for questions a minute ago. That's why I left it up. But should I wait till the very end?
It's up to you, Board Member Earl.
Okay. Here's two questions. When you talked about academic growth back at the completion of the first section, are you talking about our end of the year assessment or different growth models? So right there on student outcomes, the academic growth, is that just specifically to the end of the year assessment?
It is, yes. It's okay. Looking at among students with the same score in the prior year, how did they perform in the following year relative to what would be expected given where they started?
Sure. I understand that. I just wanted to make sure that was the growth model we were using and it wasn't growth according to what other measurements are being used at different schools. So it's just a broad end of year assessment. Okay. And then my other question is on slide 13. So number 3, I just was seeking just a little bit more clarification on, 13. Sorry. Thank you.
Sorry.
Sorry,
and I apologize. I might not be finding slide 13. Is it earlier when Tiffany presented?
Yes, it was.
Okay. Here, I'll pass. There we go. All right. Sorry.
Right there. So number 3, I guess I know how tricky some of this taxpayer, the different things are. So can you help explain this just a little further? A taxpayer's given level of tax effort should generate the same revenue regardless of the taxable assessed value. Just help me understand that in maybe simple terms.
Well, I think I'll let Tiffany kick us off.
Happy to. I think any of these guys would probably do a much better job than I'm about to do. But the way that I would think about it is, for example, if you levy a 0.01, tax rate in a district, that should lead to the same amount of revenue per student in that district as it would in any other district. So the assessed valuation within your district shouldn't be highly correlated with the amount of resources available to you to fund, education. What would you? Does that help?
Yes. So if someone's being taxed on their private property, right? You're saying that it should bring in the same amount no matter where they live. Is that what I'm asking? And if so, then it's an equalization approach to a tax effort. Am I articulating that correctly?
Yeah, I think so. Jason, Justin, I see you jumping in. Jump in. Feel free.
I was just going to jump in and say,
sorry.
Yeah, so think about it as the combination of both the assessed value of the property and the rate, right? So those are the two levers you're using when you look across those different districts in Utah that gets to generating the same amount of revenue. And in some places in Utah, the combination of the assessed value and the rate, the assessed value is so high, the rate doesn't need to necessarily be as high. In other places, the rate needs to be a bit higher because of the level of assessed value. So so it's really about the kind of tax getting to that same level of revenue that are using those different dials, if you will, to get to that desired outcome.
Okay, and maybe I can ask offline. That is what I thought it was. I just wanted to make sure I understood that. So then it does speak to the even number 3. That the school would have an independent ability to generate tax according to their district, right? But at the same time, it kind of gets, if number 2 ends up creating a discrepancy there. In other words, anyways, I'm just trying to figure this out in my mind, because it really, whatever they generate here, it has to coincide with 2 in order for it to be balanced. Is that accurate? Because it's not really
Justin,
bringing more revenue, then they have it has to be balanced throughout the whole system. Okay, I'm thinking this out in my mind. So we can move on. It answered my question, unless there's something more that you want to say on that.
Well, this actually leads into the section that we're about to discuss really well. So I think just framing it here is great. There's a couple pieces in Utah's system that we really want to focus on here. So, and Alex, I think you can probably start moving down towards the section so the funding generation. So when we're talking about funding generation, we really are focused on where do state and local resources come from, or revenues come from. And when we think about those local revenues, it's a mix of the basic levy and then the voter and board levies. And so to your point, with the basic levy, that is the same amount across all districts. It's by its definition equalized. And so folks are getting the same kind of return. Taxpayers are getting the same return for their mill in that part of the system. And then I think what we're discussing a little bit here is with those board and voted levies, the state does equalize a portion of them. And so to Jason's point, if a community decides to go for either of those levies up to a certain level, the state's going to really guarantee a certain amount of revenue generation so that every taxpayer is really treated the same. But then above that amount, that is where there isn't that equalization. And so there becomes some disconnect between that concept that was in that second bullet, but leads towards the concept in the third bullet of having local control and local ability to make some of those decisions. So that's some of the balance that we'll want to think about as we have these conversations. And so if we go to the next slide, as we looked at funding generation and the general findings, the first thing that we really were focused on has a lot to do with this conversation, which is that though the state has both that basic levy and then the kind of equalization for the board and voted levies, the overall picture of equalization doesn't create enough of a disconnect, as we would like to see, between the local wealth of the community and what's available for students in the community, right? So that idea of fiscal neutrality. And so really what we're talking about somewhat, back up on that slide in 13 is the idea, and Tiffany really said this, that where you live shouldn't determine the resources available to your children. And so that's fiscal neutrality that we wanted to look at. And so Utah, again, has a very good system, has a lot of equalization and equity pieces in the system, but They're not quite at the level where we get that disconnect that we'd like to see. And so kind of the next thing we started to look at when we go to bullet 2 is, well, what is available in the system to really adjust that currently? And so the place that you can go right now where there's additional capacity in the system really are those voted and board local levies that haven't been levied at all yet. So there's additional capacity in the system. But what we found is two things. That first, when you look at board and local levies, there are more dollars at a per pupil level being raised in your wealthiest communities. And those communities still have a lot more capacity to go get more. So though there is equalization and support for the less wealthy districts within those levies, where you have a lot more dollars left to be tapped is at your highest wealth districts. So that really isn't a place where you can turn as much to help fix some of these fiscal neutrality issues. And so then in the next finding, what we were trying to look at is, well, how do other states address this issue? So how do they think about this issue and how do they get their systems to be more equitable? And so when you look at the most equitable state funding systems, what you find is that they really rely on the generation and distribution of dollars through their formulas. And what they try not to rely on too heavily, though most states still do rely somewhat on, is pure local revenue generation that is held locally and especially not equalized. So the more dollars that go through the main formula, the more equitable the systems tended to be in states across the country. And then the last piece, as we look at this picture about kind of where do dollars come from and the balance of state and local, is that Utah has one of the lowest basic tax levies among all the states we looked at who have a uniform levy as part of their system. So right now, the state, when you look at overall funding, Utah has a generally higher state percent of funding than national and a somewhat lower percent of local funding than the national average. And in part, that has to do with kind of everything that we've looked at here. So Alex, on the next slide.
Justin, can you pause for one question?
Please.
Board Member Lear.
Yes, I have a basic question that might help me process what you're saying generally, and that is, you talked in the very beginning about comparing or looking at the funding as it relates to outcomes. And when somebody asks you a question about outcomes, one of you answered that was just one annual assessment, that the outcomes are defined by one annual assessment. Do I have that much correct?
So to clarify, I can clarify here. So it's a combination of the average growth across 3 assessments, the ELA, math, and science assessments. But they are all these sort of statewide standard end-of-year assessments that the growth measure is based on. That's right.
And then a follow-up to that, if I can, Vice Chair. So what troubles me is our assessment program has been no reflection on anyone, but through a number of really unfortunate circumstances, including COVID this last spring. But for the last, perhaps like we could say 3 years, our system has been so what I'd call inadequate or broken that basing outcomes on that system seems a very false premise. So I'm if this is all just a philosophical discussion, that's great. But to draw conclusions from those assessments seems faulty right from the get-go. Does anybody have any response to that, or want to correct me that we haven't had significant problems in the last 2 or 3 years, so it's no big deal? Or I just feel like basing our outcomes on that information sets us up for false conclusions.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the question, and a couple of things that I would state on that point is that we, Alex and Justin and the remainder of the team really ensured a level of quality to look at those assessments, that the years of data that we were including in the model itself provided a sense of stability from one year to the next. I think importantly, in the consideration of this part of the method, which is one of the methods that we used in the full funding study, the requirement of having state level data that is representative of the students in the state was an essential and vital part of that, which is to Alex's point around the ELA math and science assessment, some of the only data that would qualify in that circumstance. And we certainly asked the question about other types of data, which right now those measures don't necessarily exist in Utah. And to that point, that we do recognize that for that method, the cost function analysis, that there are some limitations based on those data, which we recognize. But to my last point, the importance of pairing it with other types of methods that allow us to understand the use of resources and how those resources contribute to outcomes of students in those circumstances. And Justin will touch on this right as we're coming to the close of the presentation, in which we used a successful schools approach, which uses a definitively qualitative approach to really investigate and look into some of Utah's best performing schools relative to the population of students that they're serving, and really is a cross section of the type of student demographic and geographic location that Utah really represents, so that as we're bringing together all of these components of the research, that as Alex is presenting information at a macro level, and we perhaps are missing some of the dimensionality of the type of outcomes of students, that Justin and the team that he's working with on the successful schools side can really provide necessary color, the kind of effective engagement with students, the how well component that isn't necessarily able to be picked up by the method through the cost function. So the mixed methods approach that we use in the study for us is a vital component to really address your question if you were just looking at a single component of the study. Does that address your question?
Not really, but,
okay.
But that's okay. Maybe let me listen to the rest of what you have to say. I feel like we have inadequate, incomplete data from poor assessments over the last 3 years. So I don't see how we can draw any conclusions that are meaningful about outcomes. And we also have the problem of a lot of parents who took their students, exempted their students from the assessment. And I feel like we are drawing conclusions on very inadequate data. And so it makes the whole process sort of suspect and less meaningful for me. And that seems like a simpler question than you're answering. But let me just listen for the rest, and maybe it'll make more sense as you conclude.
So, and just one quick thing before we move forward, Board Member Lear, thank you for raising this. So, and I'm not sure if Jason mentioned this, but this analysis pulled in up to 2018-19 school year, correct? So it pulled in That's 3 correct. Years of data, and 2018-19 was the most recent. And that was, if I'm remembering correctly, the year where we transitioned to RISE and we had some of the test platform administration challenges. That being said, the Center for Assessment and our Assessment Accountability Policy Advisory Committee and other groups still recommended that those results could be used in the aggregate, which is what this analysis really looks at. It suggested even that, well, I won't say anymore. I don't want to misspeak. But so I hope that helps address some of it too, is those are the years of data that were pulled in.
we have what we have. So I'm just saying it makes the study less meaningful to me because I feel like our data are not as, and maybe that's always the truth in a state when you do these kinds of studies. Maybe I'm thinking Utah is unique and it's not, that you always have less than perfect data, but we've had 3 years of a series of different problems, and so maybe this applies to previous years more fairly or more accurately than it does to the last 3 years, which has a different set of limitations. So thanks. That's okay. I'll just let me see what.
Okay.
Justin, you want to? Oh, yeah, of course, board member Lear. Go ahead, Justin.
So just quick, going to the next slide. For each of our finding areas, we just want to give a little bit of context for where we are going to be, where we are thinking about, and kind of the framing questions for the recommendations we'll come back to you all with soon. And so when we think about this generation of funding, we really are looking at how well the basic tax levy is optimized to raise that local share. Going back to that state and local contribution and how well balanced that is, as I mentioned before, Utah is generally a little heavier on the state contribution than national and a little lighter on local. And then how can we use these different mechanisms to address those disparities that we're finding in local wealth and the relationship between local wealth and what's available for students. And with that, I will kick it over to Alex.
Thanks, Justin. So I'm going to talk about the second major topic area we're covering today, which is this funding distribution topic. And I'm going to talk about some findings that relate to 3 particular aspects of this, but all of them reflect findings, results from our analyses about how the resource needs, the amount and type of, well, particularly amount of resources based on our analysis vary with respect to, in particular, student population, the size of the district, and the variation in the price of teachers, in particular teacher salaries, and how the same teacher with the same qualifications may require a different salary in different parts of the state. And all 3 of these things are just kind of generally reflecting how different needs that are a part of different contexts in the state might suggest a different amount of resources relative to their peers. And this is a kind of an adjustment that's built into the system currently with the WPU, this idea that different situations call for a different amount per pupil, and then that can be built into how much overall is provided per pupil to districts given their context and different characteristics. So in particular, I'm going to cover the results with respect to economically disadvantaged students, the results with respect to economies of scale, which is really district size, and then this variation in prices. So for the first part of this, talking about economically disadvantaged students, our first finding is really about the results from the cost function and what they suggest about if you're looking at places with the same circumstances and outcomes, except the population of economically disadvantaged students, what does our model predict their spending would look like as that population varies? And what the conclusion of the finding is that spending associated with the same outcomes increases as the population of economically disadvantaged students increases. And this finding is in line with many other studies about the additional needs that this population has and the additional resources to serve those needs that are required. And I'll just also add that this isn't this is recognized to some extent already in the system with the Enhancement for At-Risk Students program, and in other ways, I think I'll talk a little bit about. So the extension of these results then is to look at what the results imply about a pupil weight. What is the additional percentage per pupil for this population based on the findings? And what we found is that pupil weight is greater than the current effective weight. And by this, we mean if you look at all the programs currently in the system that are targeting, either targeting funds based on the size of your economically disadvantaged population, or for the purpose of supporting that population, that the additional percent provided currently through those programs is much less than what is implied by the findings in the cost function. So there's a difference. And it's also, our findings in the cost function are very much aligned with prior literature as well. And so in both cases, currently the effective weight is not as large. And then the last finding that I think we wanted to share with respect to this particular topic is the finding that in general, in the cost function, spending was associated with greater outcomes. So as everything else held constant, as outcomes improved, spending also was predicted to be higher. And so that, I think, is just pointing to the potential for additional funding for populations of students who are economically disadvantaged, and for districts who have more of those students, the potential for it to produce greater sort of improvements in outcomes. So to bring this all together, the area that our recommendation with respect to these findings will focus on is whether or not current programs like EARS and others effectively adjust for these additional needs, specifically within the population of economically disadvantaged students. Are those programs sufficiently adjusting for them, and are the mechanisms used to make that adjustment and provide that additional funding the most sort of the optimal way to do that based on our understanding of the literature and our analyses. So then moving on to the next topic, this really relates to the size of the district and this concept of economies of scale, which I'm going to cover really briefly, but I think it's sort of baked in with the necessarily existent small schools program within the basic school program. But it's the notion that if you're a very small district, you have to establish a foundational set of resources, program components, whether you have only a small number of students who are accessing those services or a larger amount. And so as you are very, very small districts, must pay more per pupil to just provide a foundation. And as they get larger, they're able to provide those same services at a smaller per pupil amount. And that represents a different need for these smaller districts. And what we found is when you look at district size in the model, holding all else constant, including outcomes, as district size declines, spending increases, which is sort of in line with this expectation in terms of economies of scale. And this finding is really well supported in the literature that this kind of effect of economies of scale that I described is present. And we're finding evidence it's present in Utah as well. And so the recommendation in this area will focus on whether the current program NEST that is meant to, at least in part, address this issue is it optimal, sort of efficient scope and scale? And if there's other ways to make this kind of an adjustment more transparent, we heard from some stakeholders, sort of there's a lot that goes into a complex formula that goes into what amount of funding is provided through NEST. So our recommendation in this area will focus on kind of those questions and thinking about our findings relative to NEST. So then moving on to the last area is a variation in local prices, in particular teacher labor and salaries. Now before I share our first finding, just to give a little bit more information about this idea, there are many states in the country who make an adjustment based on an estimation of how much more expensive it is to hire teachers in one part of their state versus another. And that's based on two differences. One, the local economy, how just expensive it is to live in a particular part of the state relative to another, and also their the attractiveness of the community and whether teachers are willing to accept a salary that might be lower than you would think given how expensive a community is, because they get sort of a lot of amenities from living in the community, and tries to pull those two pieces of this together and estimate what the differences are in terms of the local prices. And so we did conduct a pretty in-depth and Utah-specific analysis to estimate this and include it as a cost factor in the model, and found that that the price of teacher labor was at most 31% higher in some parts of the state states than others. And so that just suggests that there is variation in how much districts have to pay in teacher salaries to hire the same teacher, same qualifications. And then we were able to include it in the cost function analysis and did find what we would expect, which is that as that price goes up based on our estimate, the spending goes up in the model, holding all else constant, including outcomes again. So in communities that are more expensive, in order for them to provide the same opportunities, they have to spend more is sort of the finding from our cost function analysis. So then this recommendation will really take a look at whether or not this type of an adjustment is necessary, based on our findings, to what extent it would make a difference. And if it is, or if it were to be provided, how it could be done. There are examples in other states of how this is done. So we would draw on that to say something about the optimal way to make this type of an adjustment. Yes, sorry, Vice Chair Cummins, I saw you go off mute.
Yeah, sorry. We just have one hand up. I'm just going to, Board Member Cindy Davis has a question.
Sorry, it was a question back on the rural schools. I was just wondering if you are going to also, when you look at NES, and if that is sufficient funding with our rural districts, I was wondering if you are also going to be looking at, for example, the regional service centers and funding that goes there, and also the extra funding for administration of small schools. I think we may have lost that for districts, but rural charter schools, I think, still have that extra funding. I'm wondering if those components are all going to be studied so we can get kind of an accurate picture of if these are meeting the needs of our students in rural areas, or if it will only be NES.
I can start off, and Jason, if you want to jump in on this question as well. But I think that we would want to look at a purpose of all of these programs that you mentioned, and I think we want to consider as many programs that exist that are intended for this purpose of addressing the effect of having a very small setting and a small organizational scale. So I absolutely think we want to take a look at the programs you mentioned and see if they also, alongside NES, are focused on the same thing that our findings are picking up on. I say that only because you mentioned rural settings, and I think for us, it definitely, they're very much the same settings, but for us, it's very much the size that we're looking at, not necessarily the urbanicity, but again, the rural communities are often the smaller districts as well. But it's like, feels like kind of splitting hairs, but I think we want to be very precise, partly, I would say, because NES does have not only this issue of scale, but also it's focused on remoteness, which is in our cost function analysis is included, but is a different part of the analysis, a different finding. So that's also on our minds is, to what extent does NES serve that particular goal of adjusting for scale, as opposed to it's also trying to adjust for remoteness. So I hope that.
Thank you. It does. And that answers my question. These things are all combined to try to compensate for these economies of scale. It'll be interesting to take a look to see if they're actually doing that effectively.
It's definitely our focus on that particular part of the recommendations. So I'm going to jump back in on this third broader area that we're focusing on in our policy recommendations. And we're not going to go through findings for this one today, but we did want to just highlight that we will be looking at the related to basic programs as a category of programs in the minimum school program, and considering whether the way that it's established now is sort of an optimal way for this kind of what is generally more targeted funding, more categorical in nature, is very specific purpose, very specific way it's distributed. And we'll be thinking in particular about kind of coherence and prioritization of purpose. Does the related to basic set of programs reflect some coherence about what is intended? Stability of programming and funding is something we heard about from stakeholders in phase one, and it will be part of what we're thinking about here. The extent to which program evaluation, success of the programs, whether that's a part of it, and to what extent that might help optimize how related to basic programs are part of the constellation of programs in the minimum school program. And then also whether and to what extent it balances with the basic school program. And complements what's provided for in the basic school program with these more targeted and specific related to basic programs. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Justin to talk about our last major topic.
We've brought this up a couple of times. So to look at the effective practices in schools and districts, we are doing a set of successful schools case studies. We're right at the tail end of that. We were able to get and talk to districts over the past couple of weeks in schools, and we're talking to 10 schools, 9 districts. One of the schools is a charter school, and we're really going to be, we've identified them using both the cost function analysis, looking at successful, efficient schools, but also schools, each school also has high overall performance. And so we've talked to them, and we're getting those common practices across these settings, both on how the districts fund schools and then also how the schools utilize both their monetary and non-monetary resources, that we'll be able to come back and have a better discussion about what is happening and in these settings.
So I think that brings us to our final section. Jason, I'll turn it back over to you.
So, Vice Chair Cummins, that concludes our formal presentation. I know we were taking some question and answer throughout. I'm also aware that you have a time certain for the state superintendent's update in a couple of minutes. So happy to take maybe one more question and then want to let Tiffany close to discuss our next steps in bringing the study to its conclusion.
Thank you. Board Member Cannon, your question?
Yes, it sounds to me like the idea of equalizing local and local levies, board levies, voted levies, trying to equalize those across the street sounds like a Robin Hood type of bill that we've had in our legislature previously. Could you just tell me if you're aware of states where they have enacted these Robin Hood type of bills to equalize funding and how successful that is? I can see from the standpoint of policymakers, you know, it's great to equalize things. From the standpoint of homeowners or parents, you know, you try to get a home in an area as nice as possible so you have really good schools. Can you tell me how those two play out in your experience?
Yeah, so I think there's kind of two pieces here. So on the kind of Robin Hood, or what we'd call kind of a recapture piece, you're right, over in the grand scheme, just very few states do that. Wyoming is a state that does that pretty explicitly, but Vermont historically has done some of that. But I want to say that in this equalization sense, really the equalization is coming from the state. And so there are a lot of states who equalize these additional levies, but it's from state funding. It's not from necessarily from other locales. So it is a pretty common practice to equalize, and you all do it also, but it's coming from state funding is where this equalization comes from.
Thank you. Do you have time for one more question? We have a time, well, we don't. We have a time certain in 1 minute with another individual. So why don't we go ahead and close? Jason, were you closing?
You can close this up for the day.
Oh, yeah. So thank you, Vice Chair Cummins. So I guess I want to invite board members that if they have particular questions to please email me. I'm sorry we didn't have more time for questions. Particularly, you know, when you look at those findings and recommendations, is there some information you feel that you would need to help inform, you know, the way you're thinking about that finding or recommendation, or just any question in general? But yeah. And then in terms of next steps, we're planning to present the full recommendations to you in December with the full written report with the in-depth analysis and fun methodological details in January. So thank you so much for your time, and to be continued.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for your time and the work that's gone into this report. And a reminder, I'm sorry, board members, just go ahead and send any of those further questions to Tiffany, and she can get answers for you. So thank you for that.